Boa noite a todas e todos. Uma alegria ver a casa cheia e dar início ao terceiro FLIMUJ, o Festival Literário do Museu Judaico de São Paulo, um festival de perguntas. Esse museu existe há menos de 3 anos e é muito, enfim, uma alegria a gente poder celebrar o fato de que esse museu e esse festival já se inserem, nesse pouco tempo, no calendário cultural da cidade. A existência de um museu como esse e de um festival como esse são formas, ao nosso ver, de contribuir para a construção de um imaginário mais plural e, portanto, mais real acerca da cultura e da identidade judaica. O que fazemos aqui é buscar tratar das identidades, sobretudo da identidade judaica, com as complexidades que elas merecem. O fato do museu realizar um festival literário nos traz uma tripla responsabilidade. Em primeiro, o compromisso com a literatura, com a palavra, com o texto, afinal, um festival literário. Que façamos jus às expressões da judeidade, afinal, um festival literário judaico. E, por fim, exige que lancemos sobre o mundo uma perspectiva crítica, diversa, imaginativa. Afinal, somos um museu. Estamos todos vendo o cenário. Temperatura subindo, país queimando, o ar irrespirável, as guerras eclodem e se prolongam. E para o caos político e social em que vivemos, parece não haver saída. Aliás, como não lamentar os episódios recentes que rebaixam o nível do debate político no Brasil? A propósito do nível do debate, de pontos de vista diferentes, que a gente vai ver aqui nessa arena, queria dar uma boa notícia, que as cadeiras estão parafusadas nesse palco. Não haverá problemas quanto a isso. E, bom, brincadeiras à parte, diante dessa sobreposição de crises, que o FLIMUJ lança a pergunta: como reparar o mundo? Uma pergunta judaica, sem dúvida, mas uma pergunta urgente e universal. Para dar conta dessa pergunta, uma seleção de autoras e autores do Brasil e de fora, com perspectivas contemporâneas, que passam pelo poder imaginativo da ficção e pela potência investigativa da não-ficção. E a todos os autores, as autoras, e alguns deles estão aqui presentes, mediadores, mediadoras, o nosso caloroso agradecimento. Muito obrigado por terem topado o convite. Bom, é papel desse museu, assim como de todas as instituições e indivíduos, criar e preservar fóruns de reflexão de qualidade, onde possa haver dissenso, fricção e avanço do debate público. É o que pretendemos fazer aqui nos próximos 4 dias, e por isso muito obrigado a vocês, público, que é a razão desse festival existir. Bom, sobre os agradecimentos, eu queria fazer questão aqui de reconhecer quem coloca tudo isso de pé. Em primeiro lugar, nosso grande parceiro, cientista social, Daniel Dueck, curador dessa edição. O Daniel fez a curadoria ano passado junto com Rita Palmeira, aqui presente também. Uma satisfação enorme, viu, Daniel? Obrigado por ser nosso parceiro, uma grande jornada aí juntos. Bom, aos nossos voluntários aqui também presentes, apoiadores, parceiros também que viabilizam diversas dessas mesas, patrocinadores, mantenedores, patronos também aqui presentes, que garantem generosamente a sustentabilidade dessa instituição. E a equipe do Museu Judaico, todas e todos, de todas as áreas, pelo empenho absoluto que colocam aqui, não só nesse projeto, mas em todos. Muito obrigado também. Bom, e para representar essa grande equipe do museu, eu queria fazer um agradecimento especial a 2 lideranças aqui do Museu Judaico, muito importantes. Marília Neustein, diretora de comunicação. Mariana Lorenzi, coordenadora de Curadoria e Participação. A Marília e a Mariana têm desempenhado um papel fundamental aqui, não só no festival, mas no museu. Eu queria agradecer a elas pela excelência do trabalho, pela paixão, pelo empenho, a energia que vocês colocam. Então, por favor, vocês ao palco e excelente festival para todos.
A gente vai ser bem breve. Eu só queria dizer que é uma alegria fazer parte desse festival. E agradecer aos times do museu que, de fato, trabalharam muito. Deu muito trabalho esse festival. E é isso. É um festival que também fala de afetos, Então, por aí.
Boa noite. Ecoar os agradecimentos da MA para a equipe. E também acho que destacar algumas pessoas que realmente se empenharam muito para pôr esse festival de pé. Então, o Lucas Fabrício, que orquestrou toda essa produção junto com a Débora Seton, a Marina Barbosa, a Juliana Monteiro, a Isadora Witt, a Larissa Cruz da Comunicação, da equipe da MA, o Leonardo Moreira, que também ajuda a gente no andamento desses dias de festival. E vou chamar agora o nosso curador pelo 2º ano consecutivo, Daniel Dueck, para dar umas palavras.
Boa noite. Que bom que vocês estão aqui. É muito bacana ver esse auditório cheio, ver as pessoas que vieram, porque, como foi dito, de fato, a gente vem trabalhando nesse festival há muitos meses, deu muito trabalho. A gente está esgotado, mas muito animado de estar aqui e de isso estar acontecendo. Então, eu fico bastante feliz de ver todos aqui. Queria mencionar, além de todos que foram mencionados, 3 parceiros especiais para nossas mesas. Um deles para essa primeira mesa, o Instituto Brasil-Israel. Um para a mesa que vai acontecer no sábado, Instituto Goethe, e um para a mesa que acontece amanhã, Embaixada da França no Brasil. Acho que são parceiros que, além de apoiar e viabilizar que as mesas aconteçam, dialogam muito conosco, trocam ideias, sugerem nomes, enfim, e, de fato, ajudam a levantar e o festival ter a cara que ele tem. Na tradição judaica, uma das maneiras de se referir à criação do mundo e à existência de desigualdades sociais, de injustiças, se dá por meio de uma metáfora. O universo é comparado a um grande vaso que se quebrou, devido à intensidade da luz divina contida no seu interior. Desde então, o mundo encontra-se em pedaços, o que explicaria a sua imperfeição de origem. Cabe às criaturas humanas atuarem proativamente para consertá-lo. Daí origina-se um dos conceitos mais interessantes do judaísmo, o de reparar o mundo. No hebraico, tikkun olam. Mesmo comunidades não religiosas costumam utilizá-lo na defesa de valores como os de justiça social e preservação ambiental, de modo a afirmar o compromisso dos indivíduos uns com os outros e com os lugares à sua volta. A força dessa ideia, que se entrelaça com ideais de outros povos, encontra-se no fato de que não se trata de regressar a um passado mais ou menos idealizado, que nunca existiu, e sim de inventar uma realidade que jamais foi vivida. Nesse sentido, pode-se dizer que, contrariando tendências reacionárias, essa é uma ideia progressista. A gente vive um momento especialmente difícil. O 7 de outubro de 2023 representou um marco para muitos judeus. Por um lado, os ataques do Hamas contra o sul de Israel reavivaram traumas do passado e acentuaram uma sensação de vulnerabilidade que muitos ainda não haviam experimentado. Por outro, a resposta de Israel com ataques à faixa de Gaza provocou reflexões sobre a nossa própria responsabilidade diante de ações de um governo que fala em nosso nome. Hoje, parece claro que a onda de violência advém de crises que vêm sendo gestadas há muito tempo. Teria sido possível evitá-la? De todo modo, tragédias como essa não se limitam às fronteiras do Oriente Médio. No Brasil, desigualdades históricas, socioeconômicas, raciais, de gênero e a destruição ambiental alcançam níveis insuportáveis. Em meio a essa realidade fraturada e assumindo uma perspectiva na qual nós não somos meros destinatários da criação, mas corresponsáveis por ela, esse parece ser um momento propício para recuperar a ideia de que é preciso reparar o mundo. Como fazer isso? É o que essa terceira edição do Festival Literário do Museu Judaico de São Paulo convida a pensar. Esse festival tem outras 10 perguntas. E a primeira que gostaríamos de enfrentar é: como terminar uma guerra? Eu quero chamar ao palco a Thais Bilenky, que é jornalista, formada pela USP, colunista do UOL, apresentadora do podcast A Hora. Trabalhou na Folha de São Paulo, onde foi correspondente em Nova York, e repórter de política em Brasília e São Paulo. Na revista Piauí, apresentou os podcasts Foro de Teresina e Alexandre. Thais vai conversar com a ativista israelense, convidado especial dessa noite, Gershon Baskin. Por favor.
Boa noite a todos, todas. Obrigada, Daniel, pela introdução, Felipe, o convite, Marília, minha amiga, Mariana, todo mundo do museu, e obrigada a todo mundo que está aqui com a gente. Eu vim aprender junto com vocês e agradeço essa oportunidade. Bom, o Gershon Baskin, ele é israelense, ativista pela paz, mas ele nasceu longe de Israel, ele nasceu em Nova York e começou muito novo a despertar para essa militância, até se mudar efetivamente para Israel e aí mergulhar profundamente nos desafios que é promover a paz naquela região. Ele hoje já acumula mais de 35 anos de experiência em mediação de canais secretos entre israelenses e palestinos. Hoje ele é diretor do Oriente Médio da ICO, International Communities Organization, e diretor do Holy Land Bond, um fundo de investimento voltado à reconciliação em Israel e Palestina. Ele é mundialmente conhecido por ter sido responsável pela negociação secreta que resultou na liberação do soldado israelense Gilad Shalit, em 2011, que, enfim, foi um grande acontecimento mundial. E a gente vai falar de tudo isso em detalhes. Só estou concluindo a apresentação básica do Baskin. Ele é colunista de jornais internacionais e autor de vários livros, entre eles este aqui, Israel e Palestina, um ativista em busca da paz, que estará à venda e ele fará uma sessão de autógrafos. Já deixo o convite, o meu eu já peguei, está aqui. Baskin, eu queria começar te perguntando um pouco sobre o começo de tudo, né, para a gente te conhecer um pouco melhor. Você nasceu e cresceu nos Estados Unidos no final dos anos 50, início dos 60, tinha um movimento por direitos civis muito forte naquela época, os protestos contra a guerra do Vietnã. E eu ouvi numa entrevista sua que você, de criança ainda, batia de porta em porta com o congressista da tua região num movimento pedindo paz. Você morava inicialmente num bairro muito judaico, em Long Island, e depois você se muda para um bairro menos judaico, vai para Israel, volta para os Estados Unidos até decidir fazer aliar. Eu queria que você explicasse como é que foi esse momento inicial, né, de contato com esse tema e o que te despertou ali? Por que era essa a sua vocação?
First of all, thank you very much to the museum and to the IBI for inviting me. This is a very difficult period for me to leave Israel. And I'll talk about why and what's going on. But it's a very naturally intensive and traumatic period for all of us in Israel and in Palestine. I started as a youngster being very political. From the age of 10, I was going to demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, joining the civil rights movement. My parents were not very political, but I had to have someone drive me to demonstrations. So that's how my parents got involved. As you said, I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood. My elementary school was 80 or 90% Jewish. Being Jewish was just something that I was. It wasn't something I had to think about. Everyone around me was Jewish. We all belonged to synagogues. Even though none of us were particularly religious, it was just something you did. You belonged to a synagogue. When I was 14, we moved to a further east on Long Island to a very non-Jewish neighborhood. And in my first day in school, I was approached by a classmate who was Jewish, who had just come back from Israel, and his family was planning on making Aliyah, moving to Israel. And he told me, we're starting a chapter of Young Judea, a Zionist youth movement in the town where I was living. I didn't know what a Zionist youth movement was, but I thought it might be a good place to meet Jewish girls. So I immediately joined, and it was. But more than that, it was intellectually challenging for a young person, 14, 15 years old, who was questioning identity. When I grew up at the tail end of the 1960s, the beginning of the end of the 1960s and going into high school in the 70s, America was an alienated place for me. And the Zionist youth movement did two things. It had a push and a pull. And the push was to make us feel even more alienated from America that was engaged in an unjust war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement. And then there was the magnet of Israel, the society that was presented to us as the place where all Jews should live, being a Zionist meaning that you move to Israel. And I knew for my bar mitzvah, I dragged my parents to Israel. I really don't know where that came from, but I said, I don't want a big party. I want to be in Israel. And I remember being with relatives in Tel Aviv on a Shabbat evening, saying to my mother, I feel at home. And that was at the age of 13. And when I was 16, I already knew that Israel was going to be my home. I did what we do in the youth movement. I spent the year after high school before university in Israel, half a year on a kibbutz, half a year in Jerusalem. When I got back from that very intensive year in Israel to go to university, my parents forced me to go back, at least have a BA in my pocket before immigrating, good Jewish parents. I sat with myself trying to absorb this very intensive Zionist experience that I went through, and I had a kind of epiphany. I realized that this whole year that I spent in Israel, I didn't have a single conversation with a Palestinian Arab. Living on a kibbutz that was 2 kilometers away from an Arab village, living in Jerusalem on Mount Scopus, where I used to walk to the old city through Wadi Joe's Palestinian neighborhood between the Mount Scopus campus and the old city. And I didn't talk to anyone, and I decided that I had a huge hole of lack of knowledge about the country that I was going to make home. So I started reading everything I could get my hand on about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict. And in 1975, when I was in university, I wrote my first article in a Jewish newspaper. It was a newspaper out of Berkeley, California, called The Jewish Radical. And it was the first article I wrote calling for a two-state solution, saying that if Israel wants to be the democratic nation-state of the Jewish people, it cannot rule over another people and deny its freedom, because that makes Israel not Jewish nor democratic. And it seemed to me that the Zionist solution for Israel was the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel. It was the most logical conclusion that I could come to. Later in that year, in early 1976, I went with 2 friends from Young Judea to meet with the PLO ambassador to the United Nations, the Palestine Liberation Organization. He was an old diplomatic gentleman from East Jerusalem, very nice man, and we had a conversation with him in which we tried to convince him that the Palestinian national movement should recognize the state of Israel and support a 2-state solution. His answer to me was, "Over my dead body." He said, "We will never recognize Israel's right to exist. You stole our country, you stole our land, and you Jews should go back to where you came from." I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. In my heart of hearts, I knew that a time would come when the Palestinian national movement, the Palestinian people, would face the reality of Israel's existence. Israel exists and it's not going anywhere, and if they want to achieve freedom and independence, they're going to have to recognize Israel. So when I moved to Israel, I knew that I could not begin to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There wasn't a moment of readiness, of ripeness for that. But I knew that Israel defined itself as a democracy, and as a democracy, at that point, 18% of Israeli citizens were Palestinian Arabs. 1 of every 6 Israelis was an Arab. Today, it's 1 out of every 5. And I knew that there was no real democracy when there's no true equality between the citizens of Israel, and that's where I started my professional career.
Eu quero te perguntar sobre isso. Eu só fiz um erro de roteiro aqui, então eu preciso reparar. Essa mesa tem o apoio do Instituto Brasil-Israel e eu queria agradecer muitíssimo o Daniel Dweck pela generosidade em pensar comigo essas questões. Bom, você chega em Israel, né, depois de fazer aliar, depois de migrar para lá definitivamente, e vai morar 22 anos de idade e vai morar numa cidade predominantemente árabe e passa anos totalmente árabe e passa anos morando, não sei se na mesma cidade ou 2 anos. Nesse momento, bom, você fica totalmente imerso num ambiente profundamente diferente do seu e toma conhecimento da cultura árabe, que até então era uma grande desconhecida, e que continua sendo para boa parte das pessoas que moram em Israel e no resto do mundo. Você pode contar um pouco o que você descobriu dos hábitos e culturas árabes, palestinas? Tem uma passagem no livro que você fala, inclusive fiquei curiosa sobre isso, que um palestino deixa um pouco de comida no prato para sinalizar que ele está satisfeito, né? Você teve que aprender isso depois de ter que repetir muitas vezes o prato. Como é que é viver numa cidade totalmente árabe?
When I knew that I was going to live in Israel, and I had already published what I thought the solution to the conflict was, the 2-state solution, a Palestinian state next to Israel, I was attacked by almost every Israeli that I already knew in New York. And they would say to me, "You don't understand. You're a stupid, naive American. You didn't serve in the army." The one sentence that everyone said to me and just drove me crazy was, "You don't know them," them being the Arabs. I was too ignorant at the time to be able to ask them how they knew them. Had I been wise enough to ask them that question, I would have discovered that they don't. But I didn't know to ask the question. What I knew that I had to do if I was going to be engaged politically when I become an Israeli is I have to find some way of gaining credibility. I actually applied to do a master's degree at the American University of Beirut, but the civil war was going on, and they sent me forms that I needed to fill out, relieving them of any responsibility if I get killed. And I thought to myself, I'm crazy, but I'm not that crazy. I heard about a reform rabbi, an American reform rabbi, who was kind of a radical in the reform movement, who was organizing a program of bringing American Jewish university graduates to live in Arab villages in Israel to engage in community work and building relations with nearby Jewish communities. It was called Interns for Peace. They had an office in New York City. I was going to New York University down in Greenwich Village. The office of this organization was nearby. I went in, and the next day I signed up, and I became the first intern for peace. And it was in this framework that I actually made aliyah. I was on a kibbutz for 6 months in a training program, and then moved to a village called Kufar Kara, which is, if anyone knows the geography, between Hadera and Afula, in an area called Wadi Ara, the village of 8,000 people at the time. And I moved there together with 3 other colleagues from the program. 2 of them ended up leaving after 3 months, and the 3rd person left after a year, and I stayed there the whole 2 years. What I discovered, we used to meet, we had 3 groups of people living in 3 different villages, and we would meet once a month on the kibbutz, where we had started for a day of meetings. And in gratitude to the kibbutz, we would work half a day on the kibbutz. And after 3 months of living in the village, and this village is 1.5 kilometers from this kibbutz, they're neighbors. The kibbutz was established in 1948. This village was there for, at that time, more than 300 years. After 3 months of living in the village, I was working in the kibbutz factory. They manufactured plastic products. And one of the old men on the kibbutz asked me, "Ma shlom ha'arabushim shelanu?" He said, "How are these?" He used a curse word in Arabic, a really unpleasant word, arabushim, sort of like dirty Arabs. And I started telling him about his neighbors. Now, kibbutz has a work ethic. They would take a 15-minute coffee break and go back to work. But he asked me a question about his neighbors that he's been living next to since 1948, and I started telling him about his neighbors. And all the workers of the factory sat down around me and spent 45 minutes listening to me telling them about their neighbors. I knew at that moment that the credibility that I sought, I was already beginning to achieve in 3 months. How Israelis would ask me, "You're living in an Arab village, aren't you afraid?" That would always be the first question. And the truth is that the house that I lived in didn't even have a lock on the door. My house was open 24/7. Arabs have a tradition. If you walk by their home and they're sitting outside or see you, they say, "Tfaddal, please come in." I knew it was mostly out of courtesy and out of the culture, but I'm an outsider. So during the 2 years that I lived in the village, I visited more than 500 homes. I kept a list. I took advantage of their hospitality, knowing that "Tfaddal" means come in. This is how I met everyone in the village, drank an enormous amount of coffee. I forgot the original question.
Mas a gente estava chegando nela. Não, eu te perguntei o que você descobriu sobre a cultura e a hospitalidade, sobre o que você descobriu sobre a cultura árabe nesses anos que.
Okay, right. So, the first Arab wedding I went to, now the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel all do weddings in big wedding halls, just like the Jews do. But in those days, the weddings were in the village. And the women of the family cooked these huge pots, and basically everyone in the village is invited. And you never know how many people are coming, so they have a big tent set up with long tables and plates. And I was invited to the wedding, and I was escorted into the hall with a plate, and before I could turn around, a plate of food was put in front of me. It was rice and meat and salad and pita, and there was hummus and things on the table. And I grew up in America where my mother said, "Clean your plate. Eat everything that's on your plate." So I ate all the food that was on my plate. Before I could move my head, there was another plate in front of me. And I kept discovering this. Whenever I was hosted by someone, there was no end to the hospitality, starting with tea, then having coffee, then fruit, and then something else. And I never knew how to say enough, because if you say enough, I'm full, it doesn't work. What I did discover after many years is, first of all, the trick of leaving something on the plate. Never clean your plate. Never drink all the tea, never drink all the coffee. Leave a little bit. And the magic word is Alhamdulillah, which is praise God. Once you praise God, they finish asking you. That's the trick that I learned.
Good to know. E aí, como é que você começou a trabalhar profissionalmente, vai como um mediador de paz? Aonde começa essa história?
In my second year of living in the village, we had a delegation visit us from Los Angeles. And there was someone in the delegation who worked for the county of Los Angeles in ethnic group relations within the county. And he told me that there were more than 160 employees of the county of Los Angeles employed by the county to work on improving ethnic group relations within the county of Los Angeles. And I said, wow, I wonder how many Israelis are working for the Israeli government on Jewish-Arab relations. And of course, I discovered 0. I wrote a letter to Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and I wrote to him and I said, you're a Democrat, you believe in democracy, you believe in equality. He did, but yet the state of Israel isn't doing anything proactive to build better relations between the Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel, 18% of the citizenry. And I got a response, and I got invited to Jerusalem, and I met with the Prime Minister's advisor on Arab affairs, and I said to him, hire me. I wrote a proposal, which was initially accepted in principle, but Israel was going through an economic crisis at the time, and there was a budget freeze. A member of Knesset from one of the left-wing parties, an Arab member of Knesset named Mohammed Wattad, who lived in a nearby village who I had the opportunity of meeting when I was living in the village, I contacted him, and he found a hidden line in the budget of the Ministry of Immigration Absorption. They had created a project that was never implemented called Project 200. And the idea of the project was to take 200 new immigrants from the West, academics, university graduates, where they would be integrated into a ministry in the government and funded for 1 year by the Ministry of Absorption, and the second year by the ministry that's absorbing them. So here was an Arab member of Knesset who was helping a Jew make immigration to Israel. And that's how I got hired as the first civil servant in Israel, working for Jewish-Arab relations. And through the Ministry of Education, we created a department for education for democracy and coexistence. With German government funding, we created the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence, which I then went on to direct for 7 years. I was 26 years old at the time that I took over this institute with a budget from the German government supported by the Prime Minister's Office and the Ministry of Education, and we went to work. But my passion was really working cross-boundary, not on the issue of democracy and coexistence with Israel, but in addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I knew that as long as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict exists, there will never be true equality between the Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel, because the Arab citizens of Israel are Palestinians, and they will always be looked at as suspects of allying with the enemy more than with their own state. And I knew that eventually that's where I had to go. In March of 1988, 4 months into the first Intifada, which broke out in December of 1987, after an accident that took place in the Gaza Strip between an Israeli army vehicle and a vehicle carrying Palestinian workers from the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, the army truck collided with this vehicle and 4 of the workers were killed. And demonstrations broke out of Gaza, massive demonstrations that flew over the state of Israel into East Jerusalem and then the West Bank. And within a week, we learned a new word, intifada, which means throwing off or an uprising. And this intifada was being directed by political leaders from the 4 main Palestinian political factions, and they were issuing leaflets, flyers. We didn't have WhatsApp and SMSs and faxes in those days. There were actually paper flyers that were being issued in the name of the United Command of the Intifada. And I began reading these. And as I was reading, beyond the instructions to the public of how to demonstrate and what to do, there were political messages in which they weren't talking about destroying Israel, and they weren't talking about throwing the Jews into the sea. They were demanding the creation of a Palestinian state in the territories that Israel occupied in 1967, which would live side by side with Israel. This was revolutionary. So I got on my Vespa motorcycle I was living in the south of Jerusalem, and I drove to the Dheisheh refugee camp, which is the largest refugee camp in the West Bank, just south of Bethlehem. It's about 5 kilometers away from my house. I entered the refugee camp. There was a United Nations school there. This was crazy to do in the 4th month of the Intifada. I was immediately approached by a group of young people who said to me, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And in my broken Arabic, I explained to them that I was an Israeli and I came to listen. Tell me what it is you're fighting for. What is this Intifada about? And we stood in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, and then someone said, "Yallah, come to my house." And I went into a house in the refugee camp along with about 30 people. We sat in a very small room, and I spent 6 hours in Dheisheh that day, and not once did I hear the words of the PLO ambassador from 1976 who said over my dead body. These people said, "Get out of our lives. We don't want you to occupy us anymore. We want freedom. We want our state, and we're willing to live in peace with you." I was buzzing with energy when I got home. I wrote a letter of resignation to the Ministry of Education to be the director of the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence. And I wrote an advertisement, which I then published in 3 Palestinian daily newspapers. The advertisement said, "If you believe in the two-state solution, if you believe that Palestinians and Israelis can work together, give me a call." Talk about cultural ignorance. I published the ad on a Friday because in Israel, everyone buys newspapers on Friday. I didn't know at that point that in Palestine, Friday is the day when they sell the least amount of newspapers because people don't go to work, they're at home. But it doesn't matter. By Saturday night, I received, I believe, 63 phone calls. I made appointments with anyone who was willing to meet with me. I spent the next 5 days in the courtyard of the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem, and I met with 23 Palestinians. I prepared a paper that I asked them all to read. It was about 1.5 pages long, that put down the following. It said that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was an existential conflict before the Intifada. It was either us or them. The Intifada changed the dimensions of the conflict into a conflict over issues. And I proposed that there were 7 issues. Palestinian statehood and the nature of its sovereignty, the delineation of borders between the state of Israel and the state of Palestine, the separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which goes through Israel, the future of Jerusalem, claimed by both sides, the issue of Palestinian refugees, the nature of economic relations between the two states where one is relatively rich and the other is relatively poor, and the last one was water and natural resources. And I propose that in order to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have to resolve all 7 of these issues. It's a package deal. You can't have an agreement that resolves 6 and leaves Jerusalem out or leaves refugees out. It's a package deal. By the way, it's the same 7 issues today. Nothing has changed. What I would add to it is an 8th issue, and that's the component of security. And here I mean security for both Israelis and Palestinians.
Que está, inclusive, na origem da tua proposta em relação à guerra que está em curso. Mas antes de chegar nela, eu queria falar de um momento bem anterior. Como é que você abriu um canal de comunicação com o Hamas? E como que isso foi parar no caso Gilad Shalit?
In 2005, while I was running a seminar about the future of Jerusalem in Switzerland, I received a phone call from my wife, who told me that one of her first cousins was missing. My wife comes from an Iraqi family. My wife had 36 first cousins. I have 2. One of these cousins, it was her age. She grew up with him in Netanya. He had been in my car 3 weeks before. We had come back from a family occasion in Netanya, and he was in the car with us. His name was Sasson Noriel. Sasson had a factory in a settlement industrial zone, and the story was that one of his Palestinian workers told him that there was a factory in Ramallah that had closed down and all the equipment was brand new and for sale. And he was enticed to go to Ramallah, and he didn't come home. The family asked me to use my contacts with Palestinians to find him. I tried. I called up my partner in Jerusalem. He went to Ramallah and asked around at the Palestinian security. No one knew anything. A few days later, Hamas published a video on one of their websites with Sasson handcuffed and blindfolded. Sasson spoke Arabic, so in Arabic, he read out a call for Israel to release Palestinian prisoners in exchange for his life. And a few days later, the Israeli security found his body thrown on the side of a road in the West Bank. He had been butchered with a butcher's knife by Hamas. At his funeral, which was attended by more than 1,000 people, who most of them didn't know Sasson, but the close family was standing over his grave and crying, and I cried. And I thought to myself, they asked me to help, and I couldn't help. And I swore to myself over Sasson's grave that if ever again something like that happens, I would do everything humanly possible to help. A few months later, I was attending a conference in Cairo sponsored by the World Bank on economic development in the Mediterranean. And on the first day of the I was the only Israeli there. And the first day of the conference, a Palestinian from Gaza that I know, who's a professor of economics, approached me with another man he was with. And he said to me, Gershon, I want you to meet Professor Mohammed Migdad. He's from the Islamic University of Gaza. He teaches economics, and he's a member of Hamas. I've been working every day with Palestinians for more than 20 years by that point. I never had a conversation with anyone from Hamas. This man traveled from Gaza to Cairo because he heard there might be an Israeli there, and he had never spoken to an Israeli, never met a Jew before. During the next 2 days, we spent about 6 hours in dialogue. It, by the way, reminded me of the conversation with the Palestinian ambassador in 1976. The gaps were so huge between our understanding, but when we left the conference, I proposed to Mohammed Migdad that we create a dialogue. He would bring some Hamas academics, I would bring Israelis. I would check on the legality of how we can do this. I found 4 countries that were willing to sponsor us. In the end, it didn't happen because the Hamas leadership vetoed it. But in the process of trying to create this video, I went to Gaza. I met with Professor Migdad and his colleagues at the Islamic University, which had a beautiful campus. It doesn't exist anymore. The most beautiful building on the campus, by the way, was the Faculty of Engineering, where they manufactured all the rockets and bombs and things that they used against us. That building was built, by the way, with US government money. Talk about ironies. But in the process, Mohammed Migdad and I went to the Prime Minister's office, Ismail Haniyeh, who's also no longer around. And we sat for 2 hours with one of Ismail Haniyeh's advisors, who at the end of the conversation said he would join the group. Again, it didn't happen because the Hamas leadership in Syria vetoed it and said no dialogue with Israelis. But in the process, I invited the professor to attend an Israeli-Palestinian meeting I organized that was in Istanbul, and he came. It was his first time meeting other Israelis and being in an Israeli-Palestinian meeting. On June 26, 2006, I think it was the 26th, Hamas commandos entered through a tunnel to an Israeli military base. They shot an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, at the tank that was at the edge of the base that went aflame. The soldiers, acting out of orders, opened up the hatch of the tank and climbed out. 2 of the soldiers were killed on the spot. One of the Palestinians climbed on the tank and dropped a hand grenade in it, exploded inside, and they pulled out a 3rd soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was wounded, and dragged him off to Gaza. It took more than an hour before the Israeli army knew that they were missing a soldier. After that, the Israelis immediately began a military operation called Summer Rains, in which they were bombing Gaza, trying to cut off roads that led out of Gaza, blew up the electricity plant and water installations. And a week later, on July 1st, 2006, Mohammed Migdad calls me early in the morning and says, Gershon, we have to do something. I said, what can we do? He said, let's try to open up a channel of communication. He went to the Prime Minister's office. The Hamas Director General of the Prime Minister's office called me and told me that someone else would be calling me. About half an hour later, I received the phone call from Dr. Razi Hamad, who's become very famous in this war. It was the first of well over 1,000 conversations that we've had over the last 18 years, and communications and face-to-face meetings. Razi Hamid suggested that we organize a telephone call with the father of the Israeli soldier. I'm sitting in my kitchen talking to this Hamas guy on the telephone. First of all, he spoke to me in Hebrew.
Excuse me. At this time, you were living
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem.
Yeah. I moved to Jerusalem after I left the village. I've been living in the same house in Jerusalem for 33 years. I've been living in Israel now 46 years. Razi Hamid started speaking to me in Hebrew, and I said to him, you can speak Arabic, you can speak English. He says, no, I like to speak Hebrew. He spent 7 years in Israeli prison where he learned Hebrew. Then he suggested a phone call with the soldier's father. Now, I'm looking at my 2 sons who are sitting in the kitchen, who are pre-army age, thinking about, what if my sons were held hostage in Gaza? Here's a guy from Hamas who's suggesting a phone call with the father of the soldiers. These were 2 big surprises on that day. It took me a few hours to find the Shalit family, to get their number, and to talk to them and ask them if they were willing to talk to someone from Hamas. They said, of course. We want to know the condition of our son. We want to know what they want to free him. The phone call took place later that afternoon, and the next day, Aviva and Noam Shalit, Gilad's parents, came to Jerusalem, and I met with them in Jerusalem and said, from now until the day that Gilad Shalit comes home, I am with you at your side, helping in any way that I can. Now, Israel was at war with Gaza. 12 days later, 2 Israeli soldiers were abducted into Lebanon, and the war in Lebanon erupted. Israel is being fired on with rockets from the north, from Lebanon and from Gaza. Israel is at war with 2 fronts, and Hamas tells me they want a ceasefire. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert is someone that I knew. He knew who I was. I knew that there was no way that I could just pick up the phone to the Prime Minister's office and say, hey, can I speak to the Prime Minister? I have a message from Hamas. So I thought, how am I going to get messages to Olmert? I remembered that his daughter, Dana, had participated in a demonstration against the chief of staff of the Israeli army. And she was filmed at the demonstration. It became a big story in Israel, and I picked up the phone and called Dana Olmert and asked her if she would be willing to deliver messages to her father from Hamas. And she immediately said yes. So I had a direct channel to the Prime Minister through his daughter. I knew that in order to have credibility, to actually try and mediate, I needed to get proof that Gilad Shalit was alive. Now, Olmert said, we know he's alive. He also said, we don't negotiate with terrorists, and we won't give anything in exchange for information. But I knew that it was important to bring a sign of life, not just to prove that Gilad Shalit was alive, but mainly to prove that I'm talking to a channel who's responsible for holding Gilad Shalit. Hamas was willing to release a videotape. They wanted Israel to release all the women and teenage prisoners. There were about 350 of them at the time. Olmert said no. Olmert also blamed Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who was then president over all of Palestine. So I went to Ramallah and met with one of Abbas's advisors for a few hours, and he spoke to Hamas and brought them down to 1 busload of women and teenage prisoners, and they agreed they would be released to Ramallah. But Olmert said no. So I went to Gaza, and I met with Razi Hamid in the Prime Minister's office. And I said to him, Razi, we have to forget the videotape. You guys made a compromise. I know you can't compromise anymore. I have an alternative suggestion. Bring me a handwritten letter from Gilad Shalit for nothing in return. And he said, why nothing? I said, because that will open negotiations, which is what you want. And he liked the idea. He told me to stay in Gaza until I hear from him. I went to some restaurant and sat there for 3 hours, and he came back to me after 3 hours saying, they like the idea and a letter is coming. Like everything, it took another 3 weeks before the letter arrived, and it took getting Noam Shalit to write a letter to Khaled Mashal, the leader of Hamas in Syria, which we had translated to Arabic. It was a letter of father to father. It wasn't a political letter. I called the Hamas office. I got the phone number of the Hamas office in Syria. I got their email. I got their fax number. He sent it by email and fax, and I called to verify that it was received. I asked to speak to Khaled Mashal. They closed the phone. They wouldn't talk to me. But the next day, I got a phone call from Ghazi Hamid saying that a letter was delivered from Gilad Shalit to the Egyptian representatives in Gaza. It took another day, and it was verified. Presto. We have a channel of communication. We have proof of life. And by this time, the Prime Minister had even appointed someone to be in charge of the file of the missing soldiers. 50 days after Gilad Shalit was abducted, there was someone finally appointed to be in charge of the file. To make a long story short, which is in another book that I wrote called The Negotiator, Freeing Gilad Shalit from Hamas, a very long story. It took 5 years and 4 months. Gilad Shalit was in captivity with lots of ups and downs, but at the end of the day, it was the secret back channel that I developed and got authorized by a Mossad officer in April of 2011, who received instructions from Mr. Netanyahu. The instructions were very simple, 3 words: bring him home. When David Maidan, the man from the Mossad, asked Netanyahu, what's my mandate? Netanyahu said, bring him home. We are now almost 1 year into the war in Gaza, and Netanyahu has not said to his 3 negotiators, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, and a retired general in charge of the negotiations, Netanyahu has not said, bring them home.
Quando o Gilad Shalit foi libertado, outros 1.027 palestinos foram soltos das prisões israelenses. E esses prisioneiros palestinos, juntos, foram responsáveis pela morte de 569 civis israelenses depois disso. Depois disso, não. E a sua libertação deixou familiares das vítimas revoltados. Eles tinham matado antes 569 israelenses e foram libertados nesse acordo. Yossi Mendelevich, por exemplo, era pai de um dos israelenses assassinados, chamado Yuval, num ataque terrorista. Ele tinha sido morto em 2003, 3 anos antes, e disse: o soldado foi libertado, mas a que custo? O Hamas obteve uma vitória e conseguiu um acordo com o qual outros nem sonharam. É razoável que os responsáveis por um massacre chocante possam celebrar com as suas famílias? Qual que é a sua resposta a isso?
One of the supreme values of Israeli society, at least we thought, part of the ethos of who we are as a people and as a society, is that we don't leave anyone behind. The world was in awe when Israel made the deal to release Gilad Shalit for 1,027 prisoners. By the way, it was actually 1,000 prisoners. But one of the principles that I negotiated with Hamas was that they were going to free all the women prisoners in Israel. And 2 days before the implementation of the deal, they discovered 27 additional women prisoners in Israel. I don't know how you lose 27 women prisoners, but rather than removing names from the list, they just said, just add them. People often ask that question today, do I have regrets about the role that I played in the deal? And my answer is no. And the reason for that is the following. One, no one ever asked me what I thought of the deal. No one thought that the deal was a good deal. No one thought it was a good deal. Yet at the time of the deal, almost 80% of Israelis supported it. At the time of the deal, Prime Minister Netanyahu presented it to the government. It was supported by the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, the chief of police, the chief of staff of the Israeli army. The entire national security establishment supported the deal. 26 members of the Israeli government voted for the deal, only 3 opposed it. The day that Gilad Shalit was released is thought to be one of the greatest days of Israelis history. The problem is not the deal that was made and the people who were released. There were more than 300 people released who killed Israelis, including 4 who were responsible for killing my wife's cousin. His widow and his children haven't spoken to me since 2011. The problem is that since 2009, when Prime Minister Netanyahu came back into power, and he's the longest-serving prime minister in Israel, serving almost completely since 2009, He has created a strategy and implemented a strategy to not negotiate peace with the Palestinians, to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And his strategy was so successful that the entire world paid lip service to the two-state solution. Who doesn't support the two-state solution? But who amongst the important countries of the world, the rich and the powerful countries of the world, recognize the state of Palestine? I don't know how you can talk about a two-state solution and only recognize one of them. In 2012 and 2013, after the success of my involvement with Gilad Shalit, I had intensive face-to-face meetings with Mahmoud Abbas, who proposed that we create a secret direct channel between him and Netanyahu to negotiate a fair peace deal. And Netanyahu rejected it 3 times. He refused to negotiate with Abbas. It is clear that Netanyahu empowered Hamas, got Hamas funded in order to keep a weakened Hamas in power that we would hit every few years like a lawnmower, mowing the lawn. Every few years, have a war, a mini war with Hamas, and to delegitimize Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, who were interested in a two-state solution. Believe me, Mahmoud Abbas has done enough to delegitimize himself. He's 89 years old, in the 18th year of a 4-year term, and enjoys zero legitimacy from his people. But the main reason why he lost his legitimacy is because he promised that he would bring them freedom and liberation through peace, through nonviolence. He still cooperates with the Israeli security against terrorism, but he's not a legitimate leader. We had 5 rounds of elections in Israel where the Palestinian issue wasn't even brought up. The most consequential existential issue to the state of Israel that defines itself as a Jewish state and a democratic state. And between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs. And the majority of those Palestinian Arabs live under Israel's occupation or control. They don't have democracy. And with a 50-50 split of demography in Israel, we can't call Israel a Jewish state either. What are we? We're lying to ourselves. The problem and the responsibility for what happened on October 7th was the failure and the resistance of the Israeli political system to sit down with the Palestinians and negotiate peace and sit in that room until white smoke comes up and we have a two-state solution. That's what's responsible. That Israelis were led to believe that they can occupy another people for 56 years and have peace. Or that we can lock more than 2 million people in a territory like Gaza with 80% poverty and expect to have quiet. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a reality where people were no longer willing to live under the reality in which they were living. They didn't expect what happened on October 7th to happen, because when those Hamas Nukhba fighters crossed the border to Israel, they didn't find Israeli army there. Their plan was they were sending 1,500 of their commandos across the border, and they expected 1,000 of them to be killed. They expected to be able to abduct soldiers to hold as hostages to free Palestinian prisoners. They didn't know that the army wasn't going to be there. Where was the army? Serving as the occupation police force in the West Bank, protecting settlers and settlements, not defending Israel's border where they should have been. If there had been 15 tanks on the ground and 3 helicopters in the air, October 7th wouldn't have happened. Israel was not facing the Russian army. It was facing Hamas. And if the army had been there to protect the borders, it wouldn't have happened.
Uma última pergunta em relação ao caso Gilad Shalit e a repercussão na guerra atual. Na ocasião daquele acordo entre os palestinos libertados, estava eu não vou saber pronunciar o nome dele, Yahya Sinwar, que é um dos autores apontado como, enfim, um dos responsáveis pelos ataques de 7 de outubro, hoje o líder máximo do Hamas. E na ocasião isso não chamou a atenção, o governo israelense não tomou nenhuma medida, ao contrário, ele foi libertado. essa decisão de 2011, de alguma maneira, influencia a decisão de 2023 e 2024 de não negociar?
In 2014, 2 Israeli soldiers during the war in Gaza were killed in Gaza and their bodies were taken by Hamas. In 2014, 2015, 2 Israeli civilians, mentally not well, ended up going into Gaza by themselves, one of them an Ethiopian Jew, and the second one a Bedouin Arab, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed, went into Gaza. And for 8 years, I spent negotiating with Hamas for their release. What I heard from the Israeli side in charge, the officials all the time, is that there won't be another Gilad Shalit deal. This was what they said. And Israel refused to release any Palestinian prisoner with blood on his hands, any prisoner who had killed Israelis. Hamas was not willing to make a deal that didn't free people serving life sentences. That's who they were interested in freeing. Israel is not willing, and for 8 years those negotiations were dead-ended. They didn't go anywhere. One of the people in charge of the case, when I asked him what's the difference between Gilad Shalit and these people, he said to me he used a dirty word, but he basically said they have no social value. Talking about 2 bodies of soldiers and an Ethiopian and a Bedouin. This is not Gilad Shalit, the white Ashkenazi Jew from a rooted family whose uncle was killed in the Yom Kippur War. It was a completely different set of realities. But the fact that the Gilad Shalit deal heritage lived on to this day makes it difficult for Israel to accept a deal. There will be no deal with Hamas that, one, doesn't end the war, that doesn't lead to a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, that does not release a significant number of Palestinian prisoners, and does not bring all 101 Israeli hostages home. Those are the criteria for any deal that's going to be made with the Gilad Shalit heritage or without it. There are 101 Israelis and a few foreigners who are left in Gaza now almost 1 year. Most of them are probably already dead. There were elderly people, there were children, there are women. We know of about documented 36 of the 101 who have already been killed. Some of them killed by Israeli bombs. There's an unknown number of hostages who are probably buried underneath the rubble of buildings that were bombed by Israel. There are hostages who have been executed by Hamas, and we know that every day they remain in Gaza is a risk to their lives. The United States, Qatar, and Egypt have been negotiating for 3 months with Hamas and Israel for a bad deal, for a deal that will take months to implement, during which time, in 6 weeks, 32 hostages would be returned, and then no one knows what happens in the second period of 6 weeks. And they have spent 3 months negotiating the details of a bad deal. I was brought into official negotiations with Hamas for a period of 2 weeks in May, and from 1 hour to the next, I was shut down. And it was very clear to me that the people in charge of the negotiations, Dedi Barnea, the head of the Mossad, Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, and General Nitzan Alon, who had given me instructions on how to negotiate, after 2 weeks informed Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Netanyahu had me shut down from 1 hour to the next. But about 3 weeks ago, I was approached by some families of hostages who said, Gershon, can't you do something to help? And I restarted my contacts with Hamas leaders. I wrote to about 7 or 8 of the Hamas leaders, who are all outside. Some of them are from Gaza. They instructed me to communicate with Razi Hamid, who's the person I've been in contact with for 18 years. And I asked Razi Hamid, would Hamas agree to a deal that ends the war in 3 weeks? Israel withdraws from Gaza. There's an agreed upon release of names and numbers of Palestinian prisoners, and you return all the 101 Israeli hostages. And he said, give me a couple of days. And he came back to me and said, yes, the Hamas leadership met, the negotiators met, and we accept this deal. This is what's on the table now. There is a possibility of ending this war in 3 weeks and bringing all the hostages home. Nitzan Alon, the general in charge of the negotiations, wrote to me when I presented him this deal, and I even sent last week, a week from today ago, sent him a paper from Hamas with the deal in English and in Arabic. He wrote to me on WhatsApp saying, Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war. This is from the chief negotiator. I wrote back to him, I said, when are you going to stop being afraid of Netanyahu? He wrote back to me, he's the decision maker. I wrote back to him, to the best of my knowledge, Israel is not yet a dictatorship. There are more than one decision makers in Israel. There's the cabinet, there's the government, there's the Knesset, and the people of Israel are the sovereign, not the prime minister. He's not sovereign, it's the people of Israel who are sovereign. And I further said to him, your job as negotiators is not to be yes men to the prime minister, but to present alternatives. And if the prime minister refuses them, they need to be presented to the people. 2 weeks ago, we had 700,000 Israelis on the streets demonstrating for an end to the war, for new elections, and for releasing the hostages. If you translate that into American terms, that's 25 million Americans taking to the street. Now, I think that we don't have a majority of Israelis on the street because a majority of Israelis believe what the media tells them, that Yahya Sinwar will never release all the hostages. There is life insurance. This is what, it's amazing how many people speak on behalf of Yahya Sinwar without ever having a conversation with him. But everyone knows what he wants and what he thinks. Yahya Sinwar agreed to this 3-week deal. And if it becomes official, which is what we're working to do, it's on the desk of President Biden. The Emir of Qatar has it. The head of Egyptian intelligence has it. The 3 Israeli negotiators have it. The prime minister has it. President Biden has seen it. His point man on these negotiations, Brett McGurk, has received it. Now we have to make it happen. Now we have another trick in our magic sleeves. It turns out that the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the chief prosecutor, has told us behind closed doors that if Netanyahu agrees to a deal to end the war, he will withdraw his request for warrants for arrest for Netanyahu and Gallant, the Minister of Defense. This is being presented to Netanyahu because he's going crazy over the idea that there would be an international warrant for his arrest. So who knows, maybe we have the leverage, but we know that Netanyahu has an interest in keeping this war going because his political survival is dependent upon the continuation of this war. And we know that the hostages are dying every day, and Israeli soldiers are dying every day. And let's not forget for a moment the 40 to 50,000 Palestinians who have been killed, the majority of them non-combatants, women and children and elderly people, and 2 million homeless people in Gaza today, and famine and disease spreading across Gaza today with no sanitation and no fresh water and a lack of food. There is a humanitarian catastrophe. And if there's anything that we need to learn from this war, is that we have crossed moral red lines, Hamas and the State of Israel, that should never be crossed. War crimes have been committed in this war, not only by Hamas, but by the State of Israel as well. And as I said before, when this war ends, and it will eventually end, we will still have 7 million Palestinian Arabs and 7 million Israeli Jews living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and that's not going to change. And this has to be the last war. We cannot continue to do this. We've been killing each other for 100 years. 2 surprising things happened in this war, and I'll conclude with this. One is the two-state solution is back on the table. As someone who supported the two-state solution my whole life, for the last 3 or 4 years, I thought it was dead. I thought it was no longer viable. But it's back on the table, and more countries are recognizing the state of Palestine. I think there are 152 out of the 193 member states of the United Nations that recognize the state of Israel today. Every country in the world needs to recognize the state of Israel. By the way, every country in the world needs to recognize the state of Israel. There are only 165 countries that recognize the state of Israel. If we're serious about the two-state solution, we have to call on all the countries of the world to recognize both states. That doesn't end the occupation, but it removes the veto on Palestinian statehood from Israel. And that has to happen. If we want to defeat Hamas, and we want to defeat Hamas, there is no military solution to this conflict. There's only a political solution. Palestinian leaders have said to me for years, you have to make Hamas our problem. When we know that the alternative is freedom and liberation and dignity, or Hamas, all the Palestinian people will choose freedom, liberation, and dignity. But when we have a 30-year peace process that never ends and negotiations continue and the occupation gets wider and deeper, no one believes in it anymore, that we have the reality that we have today. The second surprise that happened, and that's really, really relevant, is that on April 13th and April 14th, when Israel was attacked by Iran with 340 missiles, rockets, and drones, the countries surrounding Israel defended Israel, shot down those rockets, missiles, and drones. Without negotiations and without an agreement, a regional defense alliance was born. And when we think about how to negotiate future peace between Israel and Palestine, it's in the region. It's not another Pax Americana, where the Americans are leading another peace process in which they always support Israel and not the Palestinians, but a regional arrangement that will bring us regional security and stability and economic development, and we'll get to deal with climate change and all the other important issues that we face, but it's in the region. Maybe we need the Americans to take the initiative, but then we need them to stand aside, because we and our neighbors need to do it. Now, I was engaged over the last months bringing together two former Israeli and Palestinian politicians, Prime Minister Olmert, who negotiated closer to peace with the Palestinians than any other Israeli leader, and Nasser al-Kidwa. Very briefly. I see your...
The people want you to ask.
Okay, very briefly, Nasser al-Kidwa and Ehud Olmert negotiated with the help of myself and a Palestinian colleague a proposal, a vision for a two-state solution, for ending the war in Gaza, for creating a legitimate temporary administration in Gaza run by Palestinians. Nasser al-Kidwa is a former PLO ambassador in the United Nations for 17 years, a former foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, the nephew of Yasser Arafat. He comes from the royal family of Palestine. He's not corrupt, he's honest, he's a diplomat, he's against violence, and he believes in the two-state solution, and he was willing to sign an agreement with the former Prime Minister of Israel. We were together in Abu Dhabi 3 nights ago with the Foreign Minister of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Abdullah, presenting it to him. Today, they met with the Foreign Minister of Germany. It's being presented to the Israeli public, the Palestinian public, and to the world. There is a vision for a two-state solution by two important Israeli and Palestinian leaders who may also have some political future. And that's what we have to work for.
Você viveu semanas atrás um drama particular, que é um drama que se impõe para quem busca a paz entre esses dois povos, que é o fato de o seu principal, talvez, interlocutor no Hamas, que você mencionou muito en passant, que é o Ghazi Hamad, ser um amigo seu de longuíssima data, sobre o qual você já falou de assuntos os mais profundos e pessoais possíveis, e ele comemorou o 7 de outubro. Você fez uma carta anunciando publicamente o rompimento, e diante desse diagnóstico aterrador que você acabou de fazer, você decidiu retomar esse contato. O quanto que é necessário superar diferenças tão profundas para se fazer a paz? E mais, o Hamas, na sua concepção de agora, é um grupo terrorista?
I never spoke about peace with Hamas. Hamas is not a partner for peace. They never will. They never were. They probably never will be. In 2012, I did try to negotiate a long-term ceasefire through Ghazi Hamad and Ahmed Jabari, who was the head of the Azzedin al-Qassam, the fighting force of Hamas. And we had reached 5 or 6 documents that I even presented to Ehud Barak, the Minister of Defense at the time, presented to the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time. And on the day that Ahmed Jabari received the last version of the text in Arabic in the morning from Ghazi Hamad, Israel assassinated him later that day. And that was the end of those negotiations for a long-term ceasefire. We're talking about a 10-year ceasefire. A hudna is an Arabic word, and it comes from the Arabic Jewish jurisprudence from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's something based on Islamic law. And we were negotiating a hudna. But I never thought we could negotiate peace with Hamas. What I believed is that we needed to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, with the leaders of the Palestinian National Movement who were ready to negotiate a two-state deal with Israel. And we failed to do that. It never happened. With Ghazi Hamad, I've been in contact with him for 18 years, and when Ghazi Hamad appeared on Lebanese television, I had found out just a few days before that he wasn't even in Gaza. On the second night of the war, I heard that the Israelis bombed his home. And I called him, and I said, Ghazi, if they're going after you, no one in Hamas is safe. No one has immunity. They're going to go after everyone. I asked him how his family was. He didn't answer. But immediately we started talking about a deal. There was low-hanging fruit. There were women and children hostages. There were elderly people and wounded and sick. And from day 2 of the war, I proposed a deal, and I found out that there were 39 women prisoners at the time and 190 teenage prisoners at the time. None of them were from Gaza. None of them had killed Israelis. They didn't have blood on their hand. None of them were important Hamas people. And I sent messages to people in the war cabinet asking them if they would be willing to make a deal. I talked about women, children, elderly, sick, and wounded. In the end, in November, it was the women and the children, and most of them got out. For women and teenage prisoners in Israel. That deal, by the way, was delayed by 2.5 weeks because of the Israeli military pressure. They tell us every day the military pressure will release the hostages. Until today, the military pressure has killed hostages. It hasn't released them. 8 hostages have been rescued in military missions by the Israeli army, and 101 hostages remain in Gaza. After I had published this letter to Ghazi Hamad when he appeared on Lebanese television justifying October 7th, not only justifying it, calling Israel an immoral state that didn't have a right to exist, and saying, we will do October 7th again, again, and again. I wrote him that letter, and I said, what happened to the Ghazi Hamad that I knew? You're not the same person. You are not worthy of talking to me. I wrote to him, and then I decided to publish the letter. And it went viral. I think millions of people have seen it. But a close Palestinian friend who I work with, the person that I negotiated the deal with, Nasser Kidwer and Olmert, one of my closest Palestinian friends, who I learn a lot from, said to me, Gershon, you made a mistake. Maybe your relationship with Ghazi Hamad can save additional lives. And I thought about it, and 3 weeks later I wrote him saying, Ghazi, if our contact can save human lives, then I'm willing to talk to you. About a month later, he contacted me, and we started talking again. And it was through Ghazi Hamad that I negotiated this deal, for the 3-week deal. Today I got called from the families of American Israeli hostages who are in Washington, and they proposed to the American administration to see if a separate deal could be made to free the American Israeli hostages. There are 4 living and 3 dead bodies. And I'll do anything to help save a human life, so I contacted Ghazi Hamad, and I'm waiting for a response from him. But these open channels are very important. Now, I learned that 17 members of Ghazi's family were killed by Israel in the beginning of the war. And I think that had a direct impact, although I never asked him if that impacted what he said in that Lebanese interview. It's very likely that that was the response of a person in trauma, a person hurting. I don't know who from his family was killed, but I believe it was from his close family, maybe some of his children, maybe his wife, I don't know. He was sent out of Gaza before the war. He knew the war was coming. And he was sent out of Gaza to be the spokesperson for the war. After that Lebanese interview, they took him out of that position of being the spokesperson, but he's a member of the Hamas negotiating team. And my contact with him is critical.
Tem uma leva aqui de perguntas sobre o Netanyahu. Como e quando Israel vai conseguir tirar Netanyahu do poder? Você já pensou em negociar a libertação, aspas, do Netanyahu? Existe alguma iniciativa em curso investigando potenciais fraudes de Netanyahu que o colocariam como causador de 7 de outubro?
We have a democracy which has moved far away from democracy already for years. Not only, as the general said, is Netanyahu basically the only decision maker, the Knesset, our parliament, the legislative branch of government, is meaningless. It has no authority and no power. Its original job, according to our laws, is to be the oversight of the work of the executive branch. But it has no oversight because it's controlled entirely by the executive branch. And not only that, in the history of Israel, we have never had such a low level of parliamentarians as we have now. We have scraped the bottom of the barrel. And of the 120 members of Knesset, there are maybe 12 who are worthy of representing us in our parliament. This is a real default in our system, and we've seen what Netanyahu and his government have tried to do to our judiciary system, to remove the independence of the judiciary, to make the high court subservient to the executive branch. We are on the decline in terms of a democracy. Now, Netanyahu has a coalition of 64 members out of 120. It's a solid coalition. And all of these 64 members of Knesset know that if they vote for new elections, they will probably not be elected again. The people of Israel hold them responsible. What happened on October 7th happened on their watch. They bear responsibility. So it's very difficult to get them to break. Are there 5 righteous people in Sdom? The Bible might ask us today. Are there 5 righteous people in the Israeli Knesset who would vote against the coalition? That's what it takes to bring him down, to have new elections. And according to the polls, 70% of Israelis want new elections. The majority of Israelis want a deal now to bring the hostages home, even at the price of ending the war and freeing Palestinian prisoners. Because the most important thing to our society is not leaving anyone behind. This is critical for who we are as a people. And if it turns out that our government has sacrificed the hostages in favor of keeping Netanyahu in power, we will never be the same. Our young people are already leaving. My own children, every Friday night at Shabbat dinner, say, why the hell are we staying here? What kind of future do we have in this country? Look at what's going on here. This pains me. My children were born in Israel. I'm an Israeli by choice. I have no other place in the world that I want to be. There's nothing for me to do anywhere in the world except in Israel. That's my home. And our young people want to leave. We are in crisis. Netanyahu stays in power because he continues the war. He refuses to create a commission of inquiry headed by a Supreme Court judge because he knows he will be held responsible. And he refuses to create the committee. Up to 90% of Israelis have said that they want a national commission of inquiry. And Netanyahu won't do it. There's a case now in the Supreme Court demanding that the government create a commission of inquiry. We will see if the Supreme Court has the courage to stand up and say, yes, they have to do it. And then to see if the Netanyahu government will enforce a Supreme Court decision. We don't know if the Supreme Court is going to say yes. But there has to be held responsibility. He is deflecting responsibility. He is building a case to put all the responsibility on the army, on the intelligence, on the Mossad, and on the Shin Bet. And as he said in the interviews, when he was interrogated by the police, I don't remember. They never told me that there was an impending Hamas attack. They never told me that funding Hamas from Qatar was going to be used to build tunnels and weapons. They never told me. He's the person who created the strategy to not deal with the Palestinian issue, to divide the Palestinian leadership, to tell the world that we want peace, but we have no one to negotiate with. Hamas in Gaza and an illegitimate Palestinian Authority. What do you want us to do? We want peace. I made a speech in 2009 at Bar Ilan University saying two-state solution. By the way, his father was interviewed the following day on Israeli Army radio. And his father said, I know my son. He didn't mean it. And he didn't mean it.
Além da oposição popular, politicamente, quais são as forças em oposição ao Netanyahu? Estou fazendo essa com base em outras duas que eu vou ler. Escutei uma entrevista no New York Times com o Yair Lapid, líder da oposição. Ele não pareceu crítico ao IDF, nem tão propenso a desescalar o conflito. Quem em Israel, na política, está buscando o fim da guerra, o retorno dos reféns e o cessar-fogo? Eu somo essa a uma do Daniel Strum. Assumindo que Israel, que foi a única pessoa que se identificou, por isso eu estou lendo o nome, caso queiram. Assumindo que Israel é uma democracia, como você espera produzir grandes mudanças sem participar do processo eleitoral? Dizendo de outra forma, quantas cadeiras você espera ganhar no parlamento?
We have an absence of leadership. We have leaders who are not leaders. They head political parties, but they offer no real alternative to the Israeli people. Yair Lapid has come to power by not saying anything of consequence to anyone. Testing the winds, locating the midpoint between the left and the right, and that's where you find Yair Lapid. And the less that he can say, the more he believes he will be elected. He might be right. Ariel Sharon said once, "No one ever blamed me for the speech I didn't make." Yair Lapid doesn't say anything. Benny Gantz, who's leading in the polls, is a military man who views the world through military glasses. His first election campaign when he joined politics was, "I killed more Arabs than the others." That was his election campaign. That's how he wanted to gain credibility as a leader. He has never come out and said outwardly, explicitly, that he supports a two-state solution. So we have an absence of leadership. But don't forget that before this war, we had 40 weeks of mass demonstrations in Israel to protect our democracy. And it wasn't run by the politicians, it was run by civil society. And civil society leaders stood up and took control. And when the war happened in October 7th, our government has been dysfunctional for 11 months. Civil society stood up and volunteered and created organizations that supplied support to people, money for people, food for people. They built a system of governance that assisted the people of Israel more than the Israeli government has done since October 7th. Those new leaders are out there. We may not know their names right now, but there is a new generation of Israelis who is not just looking back at what they did to us and who they are and the Holocaust, but they at least have one eye forward looking to the reality that we need to create. The reality that this has to be the last war. The other question about Netanyahu, how do we get rid of him? No. He is indicted on 3 counts of corruption. He is corrupt. If we had a normal judicial system, he would have been convicted a long time ago. The High Court made a decision, unfortunately, that he, since he had not been convicted yet, had the right to run for elections again. You know, with the indictments that Netanyahu has, he cannot be a school teacher in Israel. He cannot be a community rabbi. He cannot drive a bus, but he can be prime minister. That's our system.
Bom, a gente está chegando ao final. Eu queria fazer finalmente aqui uma pergunta final, que é o seguinte: no seu livro e nas suas colocações sempre você fala muito do desconhecimento que existe entre dois mundos muito próximos, que estão muito próximos e se desconhecem absolutamente, e a importância disso na construção de uma paz, de um convívio pacífico. Como a gente está no Brasil, a muitos quilômetros de lá, e essa questão se coloca para a gente em outra dimensão, eu queria que você fizesse uma mensagem direcionada a nós, que somos brasileiros e estamos aqui. O quanto que a gente é importante a gente conhecer, né, o outro e como que isso pode ajudar na construção de uma paz, de um conflito tão extenuante como esse.
I'm going to answer the question in two parts, because the first part is about what we need to learn from the failures and our ignorance about the other side. There are many reasons why the Oslo peace process failed. And once a peace process fails, it's much more difficult to restart it. Because if you negotiate an agreement with someone and they breach the agreement, you say to yourself, why continue negotiating? The reality is that Israel and the PLO signed 6 agreements and breached every single one of those agreements, both sides. Both sides breached the commitments that they took upon themselves. So when we look at the failures of the peace process and try to learn the lessons on how to do it properly, one of the important lessons, I believe, is that we need to start with education. Education in Oslo was an afterthought, generally an afterthought. After the agreement was signed, the negotiators realized that they had no role for the Norwegians. It was the Oslo peace process. The Norwegians have to have a job. So they called 2 of the negotiators, an Israeli and a Palestinian, and they wrote an annex to the agreement after it was already signed, the people-to-people annex. What they were doing was signing pieces of paper between regimes, not between the people of Israel and the people of Palestine. It was an afterthought. But when we begin the peace process again, education has to be one of the foundation stones of that process. Because if you want to understand a society, anywhere in the world, look at what they teach their children. What we teach our children is a reflection of what we really believe. Not what we say, but what we really believe is what we're teaching our children. And if you look at Israeli and Palestinian curricula and textbooks, we don't teach our kids to live in peace. We don't teach them that there's an option of living in peace, that there's a possibility of teaching living in peace. We don't teach them anything positive about the other side. The word Nakba, the catastrophe that happened to the Palestinians, cannot be written in an Israeli textbook by law. How do you understand Palestinians if you don't learn about the Nakba, how they saw 1948? You can't. We don't teach our children Arabic. About 1,500 Israelis graduate 12 years of education with a level of Arabic that enables them to go into the Israeli intelligence. And when they go into the intelligence, they don't know how to speak Arabic because they only study literary Arabic. So they can maybe read it, maybe, because they teach at such a low level. If we're going to make this real, then first of all, we have to agree from the beginning that we're going to evaluate our own curricula and textbooks on agreed upon criteria. There are criteria that exist from UNESCO or from the International Institute for Peace Education. There's international criteria that we can use, and both sides are going to have to take a commitment to do their own evaluation and to present the changes that they want to make. It won't be a revolutionary change, but there has to be change. And then we have to make a commitment that in Israel, every child is going to learn Hebrew and Arabic from grade 1. And it will be taught at the same level that we teach English. And the Palestinians are going to have to commit that they will teach Hebrew and Arabic from grade 1. This has to be part of the peace process. Now, with regard to you and the diaspora, in my mind, and I never understand this, it is insane to import the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to Brazil. It's total insanity. There are people who support Palestinians, there are people who support Israel. I don't know how by importing the conflict you're helping Israel or Palestine. You hurt yourselves, you don't contribute anything to the cause of helping the side that you support. Now, this is a real challenge and it's difficult. But it begins reaching out to people on the other side, part of the Free Palestine campaign, and asking them, tell me why you support Free Palestine. What does it mean for you? What's the importance for you? Why are you going to demonstrations? You start by asking a question and listening. You don't start by challenging them and telling them that they're wrong or suggesting that we have a dialogue, because they're not interested in dialogue. They're fighting for Palestine. That's not part of dialogue. That's not part of the education that they get. But you have to talk to people who live in your society, who have different views than you. And you owe it to yourself to read one thing a week that you don't agree with, that supports the other side. Don't be ignorant. There's so much information out there. By the way, everyone lies. No one tells the truth. So remember that when you're reading or listening, and try and read between the lines, try and figure it out. But it makes no sense to import this conflict to here.
Bom, muito bom te ouvir, muito obrigada por ter vindo até aqui, de tão longe. Eu queria parabenizar o museu por proporcionar esse tipo de reflexão e insistir bravamente há 3 edições, né? E que venham tantas outras, porque vocês estão fazendo exatamente o que ele está dizendo que é o caminho. Eu queria agradecer aos tradutores de Libra, Thalita e Ricieri. Aos tradutores do inglês, Aldo e Walter. Ao Instituto Brasil-Israel pelo apoio. Reiterar que a programação do festival vai até sábado e não faltam motivos para que todo mundo volte aqui até lá. E o autor estará fazendo a sua sessão de autógrafos. Fica o convite para essa mesa continuar no saguão. Boa noite.